Thank
All
you.
right, so for the council members, the goal here is to get you and us on the same page in terms of what the project requires and the decisions that you all are going to have to make. And jumping into this, I think our task force has found that this kind of an effort is much more complicated than most of the other things that certainly I've worked on for the town, and but not as complicated as I thought it was, because Jason has the ability to simplify. But also, Jason, I think Jason has a hi Joel. Jason has a PowerPoint here, which I've emailed to everybody, and I can try to put in the chat box. But I think, Jason, one of the things I'd like you to throw in there, having gone over your PowerPoint a few times, is the process of getting buy-in from the council and the community. And I don't mean selling, I mean addressing their concerns. How has that worked in the past, and what are some of the issues that we can do to have a more productive conversation, and then go where it goes?
Sure.
All right, so Jason has 5 or 6 topics. The way we're going to work this is that he'll do a topic, and then when he's ready for questions, we'll do 5 minutes of questions. Then we'll go on to the next topic, and if we have time at the end, there's time for more questions. That's not a rigid plan, because we're human beings, so being rigid doesn't work. But it's to try to keep the trains running on time so he gets finished. So once people have questions, put up your hands, and then I'll call on you, how you do that. And while Jason's starting, I'm going to try to get this thing loaded and see how I do.
Yeah, I can share my screen if that helps.
The chat box? That's good, because I can't even see the word chat box on my thing. Okay.
I don't know if everybody.
Thank you, Jason. It worked perfectly. I have already printed it out so I can make notes on it, but it's up on my screen perfectly. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me and kind of giving me, a chance to talk through some of this stormwater management, process and things that we've experienced working with other municipalities. The PowerPoint's really simple. It's more just kind of some talking points as opposed to a really informative presentation. But I think, as Mark alluded to, I think we're going to run through the first 4 items. It's reasonably quick, and then the meat and potatoes is really the next steps and like what we're going to do, or what the village is going to do to create this report, solve the problem, and get to an implementation plan. So I think there's going to be a lot of ground we cover, which is kind of why we wanted to break it up and offer some Q&A after each section so that we don't forget about it, an hour and a half from now, and try to do it at the end. So let's see. So brief introduction. I'm going to try to talk about some definition explanations to kind of go through some things. I'm going to keep everything very high level at this point. And if questions come up that need to get a little more granular, we can try to do that. Can always have a follow-on conversation later as well. Talk a little about how the problems came to be, some background. I think there's some information that varies based on the information that Mark had sent me with questions. Some of the stuff is known, some of it's not. Ways to address the problem, and then talk about the bulk of it is what are we going to do to fix this. Very quickly about myself, I've been working here in Montgomery County for the last 23 years. I focus primarily on municipal engineering. Almost all of the work I do is public in one form or fashion. A lot of the tried and true municipal stuff, water lines, sewer lines, storm drain, stormwater management, that's kind of what we focus on, and schools and parks. So that's kind of my background and what I've been doing for the last 20 years in Montgomery County, for the most part. The purpose of the work session is somewhat education. Certainly that is a component. There's fact finding, but also I'm hoping that it will spur some questions and some thought process on your end as you hear more about maybe what has been going on, or maybe what other municipalities are doing, that maybe that will get the wheels turning to generate more questions or more thoughts as it moves forward. Stormwater is not a one size fits all. So what works for one area might not work for another. So we have to keep everything, or the village really has to keep everything kind of open-minded and really make sure that you're starting with a clean slate and not bringing kind of the preconceived notions about something that maybe worked elsewhere. So I'm hoping that we can just kind of talk about the basics and get through that tonight. So some kind of explanations and definition. What is stormwater? I think the term gets thrown around all the time, and it's very simple, right? It's runoff. It's water that originates from precipitation, right? And it runs off from roofs, from roads, from driveways, from parking lots, from patios, even from grass and lawn areas. But when water falls on the ground, it hits the ground and it runs off. That's stormwater, and that's the simple way to explain it. Now there's a lot of terminology. People kind of somewhat will use things interchangeably between groundwater and surface runoff, but the stuff that falls from the sky, hits the ground and runs off, that's surface water, and that goes into a storm drain system if you have storm drains, or it goes into a ditch or a swale and eventually makes it to a stream and then a river and then to the bay for all the water in your village. So that's all surface water. When we refer to groundwater, we're talking about the aquifer that's below grade, that kind of that is within the ground and is recharged by surface water that absorbs into soil. That's basically how the groundwater stays stable and at a certain level. Groundwater fluctuates with season. So this time of year, when it's wet, get a lot of rain and snow melt and things of that nature. Water absorbs into the ground better, and groundwater elevations are higher. You may have experienced in your town, people dig holes and they have water that's coming up into that's groundwater. That's water that's kind of coming up from the ground as opposed to water that's landing on the surface and running into it. It's on a basic things, but I think the word groundwater gets thrown around a lot when people talk about, say, dry wells, for instance, or other types of treatment techniques that are below the ground surface. But that's not really groundwater. You're taking a surface water and kind of putting it below grade temporarily. So, but we'll get into that a little bit more in the future here. Pervious surfaces and impervious surfaces, and why is it important? So pervious surfaces in the state of Maryland, it's very black and white. It's either determined to be pervious and it absorbs water, or it's impervious and it doesn't absorb water. And Maryland Department of the Environment and in turn Montgomery County Department of Permitting Services will, it's clear cut. It's either one or the other. And we know in reality, there are varying degrees of pervious or impervious. And that's reality, but it's not what the regulations state or how things are determined when you do computations. So things like roads, driveways, patios, houses, roofs, those are considered impervious. Lawns, mulched areas, those are considered pervious as they absorb. But there's, it's interesting because there's a few kind of odd things. Like for instance, a swimming pool is, from a regulatory standpoint, considered impervious. But when it rains, the swimming pool fills up. It doesn't run off anywhere. But it doesn't also absorb into the ground either. So that's why it's considered impervious from a modeling standpoint, even though there's rarely any runoff from a swimming pool, for instance. So the reason why it's important, we go back to talking about groundwater. Areas that are impervious, such as a road, a building, parking lots, things like that, that don't allow water to be absorbed into the ground, it doesn't recharge that groundwater. And so areas that are highly developed tend to not get the recharge into groundwater that they are that they need to replenish the groundwater. So it tends to overall, over time, lower the groundwater table because the water's not getting back into the ground. It's just running off because of all the impervious surfaces. So the stormwater management regulations in the state of Maryland now are attempting to try to recreate surface conditions that, or replicate surface conditions that will allow the soil to absorb more water. And that's kind of the goal. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it is, when we look at a village such as yours, it's not as black and white as the regulations would intend. And we have, in our experience, been in plenty of lawns that by code would be considered pervious, but are so compact and have very high clay contents that they run off. They generate as much runoff as a patio. I'm not saying that's every lawn, but that there are cases, and that's things to look at. And I'll talk a little bit about when we talk about ways to mitigate this. There can be things that can be done in those situations that to try to improve that. The other one I want to touch on, what's the difference between stormwater management and storm drainage? I think that those two terms are probably most used interchangeably, but they're really not. Stormwater management is the treatment of stormwater runoff, whether that's by treating it for quality improvement, by filtering it in some way, treating it for volume, so controlling it to release the runoff slower, or injecting it or infiltrating it into the soil. But it's a way of treating or altering the runoff that you're occurring. Storm drainage is just a conveyance system. And I think as all the public hearings I go to, Usually I hear about people tell me about the stormwater piping in the road when they're really referring to storm drainage, which is simply just a conveyance system. It gets the water from point A to point B. Now there are ways to turn those storm drain pipes into stormwater pipes, actually, by altering their size and putting control structures on them to take advantage of the capacity in the pipe. But in general, the piping that most villages see is just a conveyance. It doesn't actually provide any treatment of quantity or quality. So we get to this stormwater, we have this rain that's coming down, all this runoff, and so what do we do with it to treat it? We use what's called best management practices, BMPs, and the state of Maryland has a laundry list of types of best management practices that are accepted in the state, and that it creates a bit of a toolbox for us to use in treating stormwater in various cases. And those BMPs have a wide range of treatment techniques. Mentioned just a few minutes ago, there are different ways to treat stormwater. Sometimes we are looking at just trying to control the volume. Sometimes there's just too much water and it overwhelms pipes, and we need to retain it or detain it temporarily and release it at a slower rate. That's called quantity control. And then there are other times where we need to clean up the pollutants in the water through filtration or infiltration, and that's a water quality component. Predominantly, the stormwater regulations in Maryland deal with water quality control with a check for quantity control. And I'll say that we design a volumetric treatment that based on some computations that the state of Maryland has come up with to treat a certain amount of runoff volume for quality control. And that's through various techniques to clean up the water with the goal of removing nutrients such as phosphorus or nitrogen or suspended solids that are in the stormwater runoff. And then we have to just do a check to verify that wherever the water's going, that the receiving area, whether that's an adjacent property, a road, or a stream, is adequate to receive the water. But there isn't a lot of universal requirement to control the quantity of stormwater runoff, except under specific conditions. If you're in a floodplain, if you have a downstream condition that is inadequate, there are times where you have to manage quantity, but not always. So that's a key component I just want to point out, because that will probably come up later as we talk about implementation strategies that the village can take on. So without getting into the weeds, what kind of BMPs do we use in Maryland? There's a couple classes that we use, and the most prevalent are what is called in this state environmental site design facilities. They are predominantly filters of some sort or surface treatments that help mitigate the volume and quality of the stormwater that's running off. You may have gone to parking lots that where they have these in the land. What used to just have a landscape island with a tree in it now is kind of a depression, and it looks like it's like a hole in the parking lot, but that's usually a stormwater facility now. And those are usually biofilters of some form, where there is a special mix of soil where the stormwater enters at the top, it filters through this special soil that's approved by the county or the state. And then it underneath at the bottom is a drain that will take the filtered water away and take it downstream. So those are probably the most prominent ones that we use. Other ones that are also very popular are pervious pavement. You may have neighbors or friends that have a pervious driveway where they would have a stone reservoir under their driveway and gaps in their pavers, or a special type of concrete where the water goes through it. Then that absorbs the water, filters it, gets some of it to absorb into the soil, and slowly let it trickle out and go downstream. Probably have seen green roofs. That's also another one that is very popular. Hard to do on residential properties, but much more prevalent in commercial properties. So these types of things are probably the ones that are used the most. We do, when we can't fit those environmental site design facilities in, which we are required to do in the state of Maryland to the maximum extent practicable. When we exhaust all those low impact type facilities, filters and things of that nature, then we would use structural practices. And those could be underground vaults. They could be, which not just hold a volume of water, but also can clean it up. There are hydrodynamic separators. That's a fancy word for basically a filter that swirls the water around as it goes in and filters out sediments and oils. And then they have manufactured filters, which are cartridges, not unlike you might have in your refrigerator, that filter the water that comes out of, they make, large scale ones that we use to filter stormwater runoff. They're very expensive, but in areas where you don't have the land to put in some filter on the surface, using an underground system can be a reasonable alternative. So those are probably the two big categories, is the low impact filters, and then the structural practices that are usually underground, so you don't get to see them. But you may have, there's a lot in Bethesda area and downtown Silver Spring, these tree boxes. It looks like a curb inlet that you may see anywhere along the road, but there's a tree sticking out of the top of it. They're quite popular for retrofitting in areas that are urban. And they are similar. They accept the water from a road, they filter it through a similar media, and then the tree will provide some of the nutrient uptake, so that it's absorbing it out of the stormwater and using the phosphorus and nitrogen, so it doesn't end up down the stream. So that kind of is a quick explanation. I think that covers some of the items that were in the list that we sent. So I'll just open that up for any questions that you might have on that component before we move on. I know I'm going fast and I'm probably keeping stuff at 50,000 feet, but I'm happy to get more granular if we need to.
Yeah. Jason is Arthur Alexander on the council. Quick question. Did you suggest that a storm sewer could have some kind of, I don't know what you call it, exfiltration, that you could make it like a French drain, so that instead of simply conduiting it somewhere else, water could possibly filter out of the storm drain on its way to somewhere else?
No, we wouldn't do that under a road or something like that. What you can do is oversize the pipe and then put a control structure. So it's a good question. When we have to control the volume of runoff in a case where, say, a pipe is not adequately sized, we can at the downstream side of the pipe put in a weir or an orifice to block the water and allow it to back up in the pipe. And what we can do is oversize a section of pipe or two and allow that volume it to back up into that volume so that it can release slowly downstream to help the downstream pipes that were undersized. So, you know, a good example would be sometimes you go in, especially older sections of Montgomery County, the pipes maybe only be 12-inch diameter pipes, and they can't really pass all the water. It may not be feasible to kind of replace everything with a 36 or a 42-inch pipe. But what maybe we could do is in small stretches where there were no utility conflicts, put in a 4 or 5 foot diameter pipe and basically create like an underground pond where it would fill up and then it would have some sort of restriction on it. So it would release it at a rate where the downstream pipe was then acceptable.
Okay, Jason.
We
I
wouldn't want
wanna
to
keep you-
infiltrate water under the road because it might affect the road bed or stability of the road or other utilities.
Jason, I want to keep you moving because we've already
Yep.
burned a half an hour.
Okay.
But Gene, did you have a question or can we move on?
Keep moving.
Okay, so let's go on to how the stormwater comes to be. You said in the past tense, but I think it has a history.
You're right. And I think you probably, some of it's common sense and some of it, it might be new information, but historically, Down County in Montgomery County in general was developed at a time where there weren't design standards in place. And I'm sorry if it's a little noisy here. They're vacuuming our office. The stormwater management regulations didn't come into effect in Maryland until the early 1980s. And most of Down County was developed in the early 20th century. So it was put in at a time when there was not a lot of forethought as to how much development may occur in the future. So the infrastructure was sized, well, whether it was actually designed and sized at the time is probably up for debate. But when it was put in, it was only adequate for the time that it was put in. It was not sized to account for future growth. Now, I think in a lot of cases, WSSC has come in and upgraded water lines or replaced water lines over time. I think Washington Gas has done the same over time as needs and things have changed. But when it comes to storm drainage, the pipes that were put in the 100 years ago, a lot of them still exist today. And I think it doesn't take, a historian to realize that what Down County looked like 100 years ago in terms of impervious area is not what it looks like today. And the more impervious area you have, the more runoff you generate, the more inadequate the pipes become. And as development has occurred, over the last 100 years, I think you were established in 1916 or 18. And I bet you most of the infrastructure that you have in town was probably established around the same time. And it probably has not been upgraded since. But over that time, I would imagine many of the houses, it's just from driving around down there, many of the houses, which were probably small capes or ranches, have been replaced with much larger houses or with patios, pools, driveways that are, you know, so everything is just kind of expanded. Also, I think there's been some re-subdivision because there's different size lots throughout the town, you know, in various locations. But the culmination of redevelopment, in essence, overdevelopment, from an infrastructure standpoint, is kind of led to where we are, where you have infrastructure that was never designed for what it is. And there wasn't any oversight or regulations to prevent that from happening. It only really became part of the development process in the early 80s here in Maryland. And even up until 2000, the regulations were, you know, not as stringent. So we didn't do as much in the way of treatment, not just in volume, but in quality until then. In 2000, they did increase and modify the stormwater management regulations in the state to kind of more account for this, this idea, which is great. And then in 2010, they updated the stormwater management regulations in the state again to make it even more stringent. So the state has taken steps in the right direction to start mitigating it. The problem is that to a degree, the damage had been done, right? It's just it went unchecked for so many years and decades. So, you know, I think that the reality is that you know, given the price of real estate in the area, it makes sense to build, you know, redevelop smaller homes to bigger homes, because that's what makes sense. It's just doing it in a way that accounts for the, you know, undersized infrastructure that's present would be beneficial, as opposed to just kind of what has been happening. And so I think in most areas in Montgomery County, there's been very limited regulations that would restrict anything or require any additional analysis or management of any runoff beyond what the state minimum is. Montgomery County has, in the last 15 to 20 years, tried to make the requirements a little more stringent than the state minimums, in which they've been, I think, successful with, in trying to really do a much better job of enforcing and requiring additional measures. So, you know, I think that the problem is it's been a slow developing problem, because it isn't a problem until it's a problem, and you don't know what that tipping point exactly was. But you know, it happens so slow. You don't. It's you know, until something happens, it's hard to kind of realize that the problem's there. I think it's been, you know, climate change is something that certainly has also had a big impact on that. You know,
could you tell us about that, Jason?
Sure. You know, I
Yeah.
think there is a national climate assessment that is performed. I think that they are in the fourth national climate assessment that's being done in conjunction with several agencies, but you know, spearheaded by the federal government, where they're starting to look at rainfall data and the events that are occurring. And the reality is the regulations have always been based on a nice 24-hour storm event where the rain falls in a nice linear fashion. But the reality is that's not how rain actually falls. And I think over the last 4 or 5 years, Down County, especially where the village is, has experienced some significant rainfalls. I think around September 2020 was a big one, where I think your area got 4 or 5 inches of rain in a couple of hours. You know, and that's not what anything is designed for. We're seeing, I guess, probably, and you're probably seeing, when you have the biggest problems is usually not when you know, we get a long duration rainstorm that comes in and it rains like an entire weekend. It's usually when you get a big thunderstorm in the summer and you get an inch of rain in 15 minutes or 2 inches of rain in an hour or something like that. It's the quick hit storms that nothing is prepared or designed for. And while they're trying to update some of this rainfall data so that regulations can be changed and the modeling programs that we use can be updated so that maybe we can start modeling things differently. But the regulations and the requirements that we have to meet to get permits and to design things haven't quite caught up with the reality of what the storms that we're experiencing are. We design in Montgomery County and most of the state, really, we design for what's called the 10-year storm event, which is a storm event that has the likelihood of reoccurring once every 10 years. Well, that storm event is 4.77 inches in Montgomery County here. Well, that's over a 24-hour period. And I think I just mentioned, I think it was September 2020. Maybe it was 21. I think it was September 2020, where that Bethesda Silver Spring area inside the Beltway got 4 or 5 inches of rain in a couple of hours. So it's 4 or 5 times as intense as anything that we would design for. So it just overwhelms things, and it causes property damage, and you know, it really emphasizes the fact that the infrastructure is not quite up to snuff to deal with the current conditions. So I guess it's a lot of things that play into it as to why we're all here where we are, but you know, I don't think you can neglect the effects of the climate change, and I think it's something that is currently being studied, and there are things that we can do now, even without having changed regulations to work with, and we can talk about that later as to decisions that can be made by the village to try to get ahead of the curve when it comes to things like that. But I think that's kind of, you know, where I think the problems have come from based on my experience and what I've witnessed or talked to other consultants or reviewers about. And I'd be welcome any questions you may have about that, especially anybody that maybe had the specific history of Martin's Addition. I'm not going to claim to know the history of the village, but I am generally aware that of its age and the infrastructure's age.
Who has a question? Okay, so I think I do. Oh, Katie, do you have a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, are we living on a bunch of springs? That's what I've heard. I didn't know if Jason was aware of the spring history.
I don't know about the specific history. I will say that, you know, this whole area of Montgomery County I mean, it's prone to have some springs and some seeps. You know, it's so it wouldn't surprise me if there's some springs in and around your village, because I think that's something that is prevalent. I know that they've hit a few areas in Section 3. So they're just right across the street. So it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not specifically aware of where anything is. And that's something we can talk about in the last section, whereas. Is it Joel?
So Jason, one point that I think, oh no, I think it'll come later. I don't have a question. Go ahead. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is the right section. Jason, first of all, thank you very much. This is very helpful. I've talked to a couple experts that said that our area is known to have a whole bunch of broken water pipes. And then that could be leading to some of the issues. In fact, somebody on this call had that specific problem in their backyard. Do you know anything about that? And if so, is there any way for us to check? Would there be any way to verify whether there are broken pipes?
So I can answer it in a couple parts, I guess. So I know that there is a lot of aging infrastructure down there, not just with storm drainage, but water and sewer. I know WCC has gone through and replaced a bunch of stuff, but not everything. And so could there be a leaking water line? There could be, certainly. In terms of checking, if you have an idea that water may be coming from an old water main, you should get a water test done on it to check to see if there's chlorine. Because if it was groundwater or runoff from a storm event, there'd be no chlorine in it. If there's chlorine in it, it's treated potable water, and that's coming from a WSSC main most likely. So
What would make us think about that might be happening, that we have water that may be coming from a pipe or below ground? What would we be looking for?
So water in a water main would typically be pressurized. So it's going to be coming up from the ground up versus, coming from the sky down. So if you see water bubbling up in an area or coming out the side of a slope, somebody may mistake that as a spring. But it could, that has happened. It could be a leaking pipe. I will say if it's a large enough leak to cause a flooding problem, usually WSSC is going to catch those because that's unmetered water that they're treating and not getting paid for. And they are very keen on making sure that they capture all their water and get paid for it. So I'm not saying that doesn't mean that there isn't a leak somewhere. There's leaks all over the county. Small ones. So I would be hard pressed to think that there was like a major leak that would be dumping out a tremendous amount of water that somebody wouldn't catch from WSSC. Because they would.
Let me comment on that, Jason, because
Yep.
about 10 years ago, all of the water lines in the village were replaced.
Yep.
The main lines in the street and the leads into everyone's houses. Now, I'm not sure whether there could be old lines that were bypassed or something else, but all the main lines were replaced.
Yeah, so and usually when WCC replaces the main lines, the old lines they leave buried in the ground and then fill them with flowable fill so that they don't function as conduits for water any longer. Whether that's their water or groundwater or anything else, they usually fill them if they don't actually remove the old pipes. But it doesn't mean that a leak couldn't happen. Ground can settle and shift and a joint can open up. Those things do happen. You see water main breaks all the time. Usually they only televise the catastrophic ones that cause sinkholes or something, but there are small ones all the time. And if you see a wet area, most of your mains are under the road. So if you see any soft pavement, if you see something that's coming out the side of a street adjacent to like a fire hydrant or something like that, then it may be worth investigating or calling WCC to ask about. But they are probably going to do everything they can to cut that off so they're not losing unmetered water.
That's interesting, but it sounds like it's pretty easy to discard this assertion just by doing a couple of tests to see if the overstimulated areas of chlorine.
Yeah, if you found chlorine in it, it would most likely be potable water. You wouldn't find that in nature.
I mean, I think like people have done a good job of like plugging the areas that are regularly flooded by doing all kinds of things. So mostly everybody's redirecting their water to their sump pumps and then redirecting it elsewhere. Is that something, could we just, for those houses that have, extremely overactive sump pumps, could we just test the sump pump water? Or do we have to like dig in the ground? Like how much of an exercise is this?
The problem if it's commingling with groundwater or something that maybe a sump pump would pick up, then it's probably going to dilute it to a point where it may not be detectable. And you might have to get a little bit closer to the source. If somebody's in a situation where their sump pump's running all the time, and I know that I've seen that in action in a few places over in Section 3, like on Raymond Street and Delaware, and it generally is because there is high groundwater, and that discussion about a spring, it could be that they just are near or over an old spring that is, they're also, unless it's a newer home, it may not have an under slab drainage system that's completely or foundation drain system that is to the standards like a new house would go in. If it's a new house, it's likely groundwater, but a grab sample out of a sump pump may not give you that. You could certainly test it. It's not very hard to test or expensive to test that water, but I'd be concerned that it would get diluted to the point with groundwater that it wouldn't register. You'd have to get it a little bit closer to the source, I think, which is really difficult. I will say that, I mean, a water main being pressurized like it is, if there is a leak, it usually causes other problems, whether that's a sinkhole and undermining the soil near it, undermining the road, undermining other utilities. When that water is shooting out of a main under high pressure, it moves other stuff around it and usually causes other problems. It's rare that you get kind of a really slow leak, I guess is a way to put it.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. Thank you. And going back, I don't know if maybe this is for the next section, so feel free to punt it. Going back, I think it was Jean's question earlier. Is there a way for us to determine what all the springs are that are running under the ground in Martin's Additions?
The short answer is probably not all of them. You can get a hydrogeologist to try to map things and map water flow below grade. That can be expensive and time consuming and require buy-in from all the residents that may have to have a test hole or something dug on their property to check these things or have monitoring wells put in on the property to verify that. But I would think that in a lot of cases, because of the development within the town and the fact that it's built out, it's kind of it is what it is at this point. I don't think anybody, if they do determine that there's a spring adjacent to them or under their house or something, I think they would probably just be trying to implement an appropriate solution as opposed to, I mean, they're not going to, take the house down and restore it to, to a natural water course or something like that, I would think. So I don't know that it would be as beneficial to know the severely affected parties. I think getting an engineered solution to adequately address it and keep their basement dry, it'd probably be the better use of their funds.
Okay,
and
let's
there
move
are
on
ways
to
to
the,
effectively do it.
let's move on to your next topic, and we can always come back to all this stuff later. So keep your questions, everybody.
Yep. So Now, we have all these problems that we talked about previously, and there are numerous ways to address them, and the responsibilities lie in various locations as well. So, you know, I think we talked about earlier, there's, you know, water filtration, you know, treating the water quality, and there's also treating the volume or quantity of water as ways to do it. But, you know, there's kind of three areas. There's the areas, you know, that's on public property, which the village controls. There's areas on private property, which the town or the village doesn't have control over, but can maybe encourage or entice private residents to do something. And the third thing, which I think is something that's overlooked, would be regulatory change. That is something that hasn't been in place in the past, but you'll see some other municipalities recently have started doing that. Somerset, for instance, implemented some requirements for drainage plans. The town of Chevy Chase has requirements for drainage plans, and while that doesn't fix what's out there right now, you can put things in place that maybe will keep this from getting worse, and so that you have time to start picking away and addressing the problems that exist today. So in terms of the public property aspect, the village doesn't own a lot of land. You have your roads and not much else that is under the village control. And so small scale practices or treatment techniques within the right of way are one option to try to mitigate runoff. But typically those are very expensive because you're dealing with roadways that have a lot of stuff and a lot of competing interests. You have gas lines and water lines and sewer lines and the storm drain lines, of course, and then you may have a fiber optic line or something else that's not on a pole, but there's a lot of things going on in a very small space. So anything that you want to do is usually very costly, but you can get, you know, a lot of treatment capacity and credits for doing things in the right of way. And that can be a laundry list of things that you can do. There's what a lot of people now refer to as road diets, where you reduce the width of the pavement, or maybe if you have on-street parking, you get rid of a couple parking spaces and put a little bioretention planter in. There's all types of things. Those are not always well received by the residents. So those are probably some decisions that a council would have to make as to does the village want to do anything within the land that they control. You know, then we talk about private property. The village can entice or encourage private residents to deal with the concerns. I think in a lot of cases in the town, water flows to the people's backyards, and maybe, you know, one person's lower and it goes from one street down onto the people behind them, and encouraging people to put in rain gardens. There's a program in Montgomery County called Rainscapes, which offers an incentive to private property owners to put in rain gardens or other treatment techniques to help mitigate and control runoff. And there can be incentives that the village could add on to that. I know that's something that the town of Chevy Chase View is doing. So they're supplementing the grant from the county to try to entice and encourage private residents, because the bulk of the land in your village or in most municipalities owned by private residents, and in which case you don't have control over getting that. I guess there are limited situations where if there's a group of affected homeowners that all band together and are willing to undertake a project or grant an easement to the village to put something in, that might be an option. But we haven't, my experience has not been that people are willing to give up or take down a fence so somebody can run a pipe through, or, maybe limit their property in any way to mitigate this, but it's certainly worth a discussion. But those are all things that would have to come out of a study and an evaluation to see what's feasible. And then when you find out whether it's feasible or not, is there a willingness to implement? So I think my experience in the past in dealing with very similar situations is we can probably engineer our way out of a lot of situations. But they don't always come to fruition because you need a lot of parties to agree that it's the best option. And that is not always, feasible, and it's understandable. If I was a property owner and somebody wanted to take a 20-foot swath in my backyard, I would probably take issue with it. And so I think you'll find if people are exasperated enough at the situation, they might be willing, or if it's causing damage to their property on a regular basis, you might be able to find folks that are willing to allow for some infrastructure to be put in. But in general, it's probably more about encouraging and incentivizing people to do things on their own. So I'm happy to, I know we've gone over an hour already, so I will open it up to questions on that before we do any deeper dives into anything else.
Questions? I don't know, Jason, either we're all drunk on beer or you're doing a great job.
No, well, I want to let the committee go, but one or two questions came to mind. When you
Absolutely.
speak about groundwater and springs, is a spring anything other than you've dug too far into the and you hit groundwater?
No, I mean, a spring is an area where the capillary action in the soil is moving the water upward from the groundwater table up.
So it hits, and
if you-
it naturally hits the surface.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
It would be either pressure or capillary action, which would move the water
Right.
up, as opposed to if you're truly in groundwater and you're actually below the water table, it won't just be trickling up. It's just going to be like a standing water level, like a pond, right? If you dig down too deep, and I think that is something that has probably affected areas down by you. I know I just was dealing with one in I think it was on Florida in Section 3 that they wanted to expand the base, make the basement ceilings taller, and you dig down and boom, now you're into groundwater. I think it was so we reviewed some plans for a sump pump system, and I think they can solve that problem.
So are you aware of that being the groundwater problem being a new problem, significant here? One member on this call has had significant problems with a neighbor on this, but is this a general issue, or as people are building bigger basements, are they hitting it? Also, then before I end up, in Prince George's County, they have a requirement that builders sink a test well and then put the basement a foot above the ground, the water level. Are you aware of that, or is this
there's
We've
other
been looking for a
jurisdictions that do
problem
the
or
same
what?
thing.
Go ahead.
I think I don't believe it's a new problem. I think it may have been exacerbated by the prevalence of larger construction, because you are digging deeper holes. And one thing that I probably said this in a lot of public meetings, and I'll probably say it every time I talk to you guys. Water does not obey boundaries. It doesn't follow property lines. It always goes wherever it wants to go. And despite everything that we want, it doesn't turn it property lines or follow property lines. It goes wherever it wants to. And when you disturb a lot of soil that hadn't been disturbed in 50 or 60 years, and now it's loose and not as consolidated as it previously was, then you've given that water a conduit to flow in a different direction than it maybe hadn't flowed before. So I think it is, maybe it's been exacerbated over time through redevelopment, but I don't believe it's probably been a problem that's new. I know from talking to Andy over in Section 3, this is a problem they've battled for a very long time. I think I've only really been involved for 5 or 8 years in working over there, but I would imagine it's been something that's been prevalent for a long time.
Are you saying, Jason, that when there's a substantial movement of soil that changes the granularity and the way it'll conduct water and the directions it'll go in, that should be addressed in the permitting process? Are there things to do?
But I'm not sure that it would be extensive to try to plan for it, with the exception that I think it's covered in new construction now about a sump pump and or a lot of times they'll require a backup sump pump so that you don't have a single point of failure. But that is at least addressed now, that foundation drains and sump pumps are required, as opposed to older building code didn't require that, and not all builders put that in. So I believe down in that area that you have areas with high ground, especially at some of the lower lying areas, there is high groundwater. And the other thing the soils down there are somewhat mixed from what I can tell, in terms of it's not, marine clay, but it's not beach sand either. It's not a well infiltrating soil in general in that whole area of Montgomery County. It's not just the village. So some things that can happen is over time, there's what's called a perched water table, whereas you have a confining layer of soil in one area, and the water kind of stays on top of that, but then you poke a hole in that confining layer, say to dig a basement, and now there's an avenue for the water that was above the confining layer to go down, or now in situations where that maybe that confining layer kept it from coming up, it now can come up, depending on rainfall and everything else. So I don't know that's something that can be addressed other than to implement things following the current building codes to try to mitigate for any new construction. And for folks that have are near new construction that are experiencing problems, they would have to look at some sort of retrofit, which can be done by putting in sump pumps and foundation drains. You can do it from the inside, actually, if you can't do it on the outside.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Anybody else with a question on this
Yeah,
topic?
I have a,
Go ahead.
could I?
Go.
Okay. Jason, to what extent does the lack of storm sewers and a storm sewer system limit the availability of alternatives, so that when we're building something new, you can pump the water coming off the property out into the gutter runs down to a storm drain that then dumps it into Rock Creek or wherever all the storm drains are heading up. We don't have that option in Martin's Additions. I think I know for a fact, because I'm looking at the map, the majority of our streets do not have any storm drains on them. Not even the openings, let alone the subsystems that would carry the water away. So does that limit us to, or further limit any kind of municipal government approach to how we're gonna solve this problem.
Yes, it does.
You know,
That's the simple
big
answer,
time,
right?
big time.
So,
Thank you.
but I will say though, you know, just putting in storm drains, what is considered, storm drainage systems are generally classified as gray infrastructure, right? They're just
right.
pipes. By just putting in pipes, you're really just pushing your problem downstream to the next person.
I don't have a problem with that. Just kidding.
Yeah, no, I hear you though. You know, it to a degree, it's out of sight, out of mind. But a thoughtful approach where it's a treatment of some sort and minimizing runoff of some sort in conjunction with an appropriate conveyance can, I think the ultimate goal is to try to find a balance that you're not causing property damage when an event occurs.
And it
I
gives
think
you
that's-
options. It gives you options. Big
It does.
options. Yep.
It absolutely does. And so having a system in place would allow for individual controls on each property that would have a place to outfall so that something could be done.
Exactly.
One of the things I think you hit the nail on the head, that you don't even have any openings or anything in the street. So if you have a sump pump, your options are to basically just dump it out in your front yard. But there's certainly no way to put something below your surface, say in your front yard, and then have it overflow or tie into a road because there's nothing there to tie into. So
Or it goes into the road, or it rolls over to your neighbors, or across the sidewalk, and then it ices over in the wintertime, blah, blah. So, yeah. it's a
that
big-
is correct. This is an exceptionally complicated problem, and it seems like it should be simple because it's just water flowing downhill, but it's not. Unfortunately, it's actually quite a big problem, and in Montgomery County in particular, stormwater management is one of the hardest items to deal with on any development project that we deal with. And it's
Sure.
usually the item that, you know, holds up permits the longest. And I don't design houses, so I mean, I design like the systems that receive the water from the houses. So, but that's, you know, the stuff that we do design, the schools and the parks. It's the biggest issue and the hardest one to solve that we deal with on a regular basis.
So Jason, are you suggesting that one of the things we may face is that if there's runoff problems and we can't put it in the street, and yet we have to coax residents to do something on their property? That leaves us sort of in a box.
Yeah, so I mean, like I just said, there's a way to kind of minimize runoff through, you know, limiting impervious areas or collecting the water on site through conservation landscape or rain gardens or bioretention areas or whatnot. So you keep the water on your property and get it into the ground so it doesn't go anywhere. That's one way to try to minimize things. But if you can't keep it from on your property, then you're right. You are in a bit of a box without some piping to have that overflow or that alternative. So, because I think the reality is you can't keep all the water on your property. I mean, the storms are coming too hard, too fast. You just can't do it. So you need some sort of relief valve so you have whatever controls that you can put in place to try to help and minimize runoff. And then when that is not enough in that big storm event, then you have to have something, a safe conveyance to try to, I mean, at the end of the day, try to minimize property damage, not just to public infrastructure, but also, you know, you're trying to protect your residents.
So you agree that should be part of our study? That issue?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
I think you have to look at both green and gray infrastructure practices, which is storm drainage and stormwater management, and the two have to work hand in hand. And it may be there are areas where it's not feasible to do stormwater management, but it is feasible to put in a storm drainage system. And those are the things that you have, that the council would have to weigh as to, you know, and maybe it's multi-phase, that you get the storm drain in first with ultimate plans to put in some stormwater when funding, budget, you know, something else allows, you know, maybe, you know, you have some areas in mind that you can put a planter box in or do something, but there's a water main in the way. And so, you know, maybe you work with WSSC, or maybe there's a gas line in the way, and when Washington Gas replaces it, maybe you get them to move it out of the way so you can put the planter box in. There's when we get to this next discussion, we talk about the study, it's going to be pretty comprehensive, and you'll be looking at a lot of things and really just kind of raising a lot of ideas to try to come up with solutions. And then, but we can cover that in a minute. I think, Michael, you had a
Okay.
question.
Any other questions?
Michael had one.
Yeah,
Michael.
thanks, Jason. This is really informative. As far as the improvements on public property, a committee that the village had a number of years ago was the Walkability Committee, and they recommended doing curb extensions and enlarging like tree boxes in some specific locations. In your estimate, like how effective would those spaces be, even if they were pretty limited in the size of them, at avoiding, you know, or absorbing water as it's running down the street, especially in like low-lying areas? I know you did this study on Taylor Street.
Yep.
And there is some areas along Taylor Street that could potentially have larger tree boxes without losing parking.
So, I mean, anything that you can do where you can create a space for water to infiltrate into the ground, I think you're going to get a pretty good bang for your buck there. I will say though, with like in the case of Taylor, right, it's got so much water coming to it and so much drainage area that comes down through that whole network. It's picking all up section 3, you know, it is a massive amount. Those little treatment things there, relative to the amount of water that's going through those pipes, is probably not going to make a big dent. The tree boxes, or the areas where you're probably going to get a meaningful impact, are maybe on some more of those side streets that maybe don't currently have storm drainage, that aren't picking up 100 acres of, you know, or, you know, Taylor Street's the extreme, right? Because it's got all of section 3 coming through there, and Brookville Road, and it's got so much, and you know, I've seen the videos, right? It's a torrent coming through there. Those little pockets aren't going to make a dent in that. You're not going to fix that problem with those little things. In normal, typical rainfall events, you will get some water quality treatment, and that can still be a benefit to the environment and to the community at large. But in those flooding situations, it's not going to do anything.
Well, it sounds like the solution is really a, you know, multifaceted approach where we do a little bit of everything. But I agree that the Taylor Street is probably enlarging those pipes and gray infrastructure. I read your report from a couple years ago. So yeah.
Yeah, that one is extreme, because it's unfortunate. You have that pipe and Taylor Street, but it's not all your water. You're dealing with a lot of other people's water coming through your town.
Yeah, hi.
And it's unfortunately that's it's your road. You know, with the, but in the case of the storm drain system, right, it's Montgomery County DOT's pipe, I believe. So.
Okay, so maybe in some other areas that's a possible solution, and maybe this committee can also recommend it, which means there'd be 2 committees recommending it to the council to do it. So we could look at that.
I would also say that there are some ancillary benefits to some of these items. I don't know if speeding is a problem in your community, but
It is.
well, when you put those islands, bump outs in, it naturally will slow people down, and so it can be a way to not put up stop signs or speed bumps, which kind of can drive people nuts, or make people that plow nuts. But it is a natural traffic calming measure, and that is, so there can be some ancillary benefits to providing some of these stormwater facilities. And maybe that's not a big issue for your community, but if it is, that might be meaningful.
Right, two birds with one stone. And I feel like we've talked about, gray infrastructure, green infrastructure, and then these incentives to private property owners. Those all make sense to me. Can you talk about a little bit about this third thing on the screen, as far as regulatory change? Are you talking about like restricting what people can do on their property, or what is that?
I mean, yeah, it could go that far, sure. I mean, it could be as simple as requiring a drainage plan with every permit that comes in. And then the trigger for that drainage plan being something very small. I think when somebody rebuilds a house in your community, they have to get a permit from the county and they have to put in dry wells or they have to do something, right? But I think over time, it's the addition of a bunch of small projects. People add a deck, people add a patio. They enlarge and put an extra parking pad on their driveway or a lead walk, or it's the cumulative effect of all the small projects over time that, and we looked at that when we did the study at Chevy Chase View. If you look at historical aerial images, right, things just change over time, and you didn't need to get a permit. In their particular case, a sports court didn't need a permit. It's kind of a little loophole. If you put in a basketball court or a tennis court, it didn't need a permit. Well, it generated a lot of runoff for not needing a permit.
Mhm.
And you could kind of look over the years, and the amount of impervious area just kept growing. And you can't blame the people or any of the residents because they have property and they want to improve it and make it the way that they want. But, and I don't think any of the ideas that we came up with them would be to try to restrict and prevent people from doing things, but more or less say, if you'd like to do this, please address the drainage, that's going to come off of whatever you want to do. So it's not just, here's a permit to put a patio in, and then it's the neighbor's problem who's downstream who gets the runoff from the patio. It's, here's your patio permit, and you just need to control the runoff from that patio. And you can do that through whatever means that your patio designer comes up with, but just a way to require mitigation of the runoff for the new stuff that's built. There's also other things such as impervious caps. It may not be appropriate for your community to put a cap on impervious area because of the size of the lots. We did recommend that in Chevy Chase View because they have such a huge range of lot sizes. They had lots, the smallest lot was like 9,000, but the biggest lot was over an acre.
Right.
So you wouldn't want somebody that had an acre that could pave 75% of it, because that would, be a lot of pavement. But so we recommended kind of a sliding scale so that everybody would have the chance to put up, the new house, the driveway, the patio, like people would be able to. So there's kind of, the smaller the lot, the higher allowable percentage of impervious. And the bigger the lot, the lower the percentage. So everybody could get a kind of an equivalent amount of impervious area per se. So that it was fair and some as equitable as it could be as a way of controlling things. I
think we already have that. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. Our building codes already use the size of the lot and a percentage of an impervious surface that's allowed. And we put them in 15, 20 years ago. The difference between Chevy Chase View and Martin's Additions is they are zoned, as you know, Jason, I'm not trying to tell you something you don't know. Is there an R200 zone, right? We're at R50. We have these itty bitty lots, and we just don't have the kind of space to put in a basketball. We're putting in very expensive houses instead of a basketball court. So they're not comparable. They're just not.
And Gene, to your point, we already have one of the strictest building codes in
Yes.
the area, and there's some talk recently amongst council members and residents about restricting it even further and reducing the size of houses. And there's different ways to do that.
Yes.
one of the ways I've been looking at is actually reducing or increasing the requirement for side yards. Right now it's 8 and 18 total per side yards minimum requirement. And one way you could easily do it is say, raise it up to 20. You have to have 20 so you can build as wide of houses. Or but we already do have a non-vegetative requirement
Right.
where only 30% of your front yard can be non-vegetative.
And then
and-
make sure people play by the rules. That's
And we have a lot of people that are pushing that line in the front yard. And
Right,
like you said, some
but
of the
does
front
your
yards are very
impervious
small.
cap apply to the whole yard? To the
No,
whole
just the front,
property or just the front yard?
just the front. Yep.
But these things could be changed, but we are saying, I believe, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the county stormwater management, if builders cannot meet it or choose not to meet it, they ask for a waiver, and I'm being told that 100% of the waiver requests are being granted. You're nodding.
Yeah, I think you're
problem.
absolutely right, that if they can prove that they can't meet it on site, that they are getting waivers for that. I'm not sure if there's a fee in lieu for that waiver. That would go to some sort of general fund, or if they just get a straight up waiver. I know waivers for non-residential projects are required to pay a fee in lieu based on the amount of impervious area that you are proposing with your project.
Jason,
I
it's
think
my
that- yeah,
understanding
I think
that there
there
is
is a
money
fee.
involved. There is money involved.
Yeah, there is a fee
Granting of the
required, but the
waiver,
builders, your builders willingly pay it. Now,
Right.
from what I also heard or saw a document from Somerset that they want to take some control over that. And the policy is to give no waivers. Are you aware of that?
I did hear about that, yes, and so, I don't know what, and I guess I haven't dug deep enough to find out if they have any ability to supersede Montgomery County in any way, shape, or form. I'm not sure if they do. If the county grants a waiver, if you had something in place that would require stormwater management for your building permit, so even if they got a building permit from the county, you can say, well, great, I'm glad that you got that. To get our building permit, you need to put the stormwater in. So you just paid a waiver fee for nothing. I mean, you could do that, and I don't see why you would, that would be a problem. You'd have the wherewithal to do that, but I don't know that you could just supersede I don't think they can supersede the county. Like if the county grants a waiver, they grant the waiver. This would be in addition to, you'd have to take care of that. Now they have a drainage plan requirement that has very specific control requirements, that they have to control a certain runoff of rainfall amount. So something like that is helpful because that is above and beyond anything the county required.
We have some information, but I'll confirm it, that we can't loosen the county restrictions, but we can increase them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we touched on it earlier, and I guess we've been chit-chatting a lot about this, and I know we need to talk about the studies and things, but like we said earlier, there's no one size fits all, and for this, and every community is unique, and those concerns need to be vetted out in the context of that community and those residents. And so I know I brought up a few things that we've seen in other ones, or we did on a recent report in Chevy Chase View, but I think as Gene had mentioned, they're not apples to apples. And so all they are is thoughts and maybe, some experiences that you can draw from, but they're not things that you say, this is what we're going to do, because you can't apply one to the other. And I guess that will be the segue into, the village is going to have to undertake a study to try to figure this stuff out. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about, the steps that you really need to go through to kind of get from point A to point B. And saying, so that makes it a good segue because, I think there's buy-in on a lot of fronts when you go into a study like this, from the village, whether it's the task force or the council, and to the residents, to really have an open mind and really listen and be thoughtful about the approach to these studies. I think some people do go in with kind of preconceived notions of what they want, or I don't think that's worth it. And so I know, and in the last one I did, I swam upstream a little bit but I really kind of stuck to trying to, work on education and keep things open-minded so that all options were on the table and vetted out appropriately to see if they made sense for the community. So the study that I think that you are going to try to be embarking on in the near term, I believe Mark had informed me that you had applied for the grant from DNR to help fund the study, and that grant, if it comes through, would require a whole plethora of items to be done to satisfy the grant requirements. But there's some initial legwork that needs to be done that would probably be spearheaded by the village. And that's why I get it, just data gathering and a resident survey. And I believe the task force has already put together a draft of that survey, which Mark shared with me. And I haven't had a chance to fully review it yet, but I will in the near term. But I think it is vital to gather this data from your residents. That is, you will hear it from the horse's mouth. I mean, that is the boots on the ground. They're the people that are experiencing the problems, and they can articulate it better than any engineer or anybody else can describe what is happening on their property. So I know that when we looked at the last one, that resident survey was really what was the kickoff to our brainstorming sessions and everything moving forward into the study. And that was the first thing that was done. And it really helped us shape how the rest of the study went. So the highest level of participation possible is best. And I will say that when they fill out the survey, pictures and videos are worth 1,000 words, really. I can say from experience that I read some surveys and I looked at the videos that came with them, and I realized that the written portion embellished substantially what the video showed. And then there were other times where I read the written portion and I saw the video and I could not believe, because it did not do justice to what those people were experiencing. So pictures and videos, I think, can help tell the story, because a torrent to one person might be a trickle to another. And the way that it's written in a Google form or whatever the collection system is, some people are very wordy and eloquent and can really describe things, and other people want to fill it out quickly, so they participate and maybe don't, articulate every little thing. But if people can upload a picture or a video, that really is a substantial time saver in terms of evaluating a problem. So I think, in terms of the study, that's this data gathering and resident survey is something that can be done at any time, and it's usually spearheaded by the town. And then I guess at some point, if the grant comes through, you would hire a consultant to perform the requirements of the study, and that usually starts with an evaluation of all that survey data. What we did and what we think is kind of common practice is, we mapped out the survey data. So everybody that responded, we put dots on a map to try to come up with groupings, and then reviewed them to see if the complaints, for lack of a better word, were consistent in each area. Because we found that there were some respondents, and even though I don't want to just say that I'm referring to the Chevy Chase View one, because that was the most recent one. We have not formal DNR studies, but we have done this type of stuff for Garrett Park and other communities as well, just on a less formal basis, but also, kind of reviewing information from residents. Sometimes it turns out that it's very evident when somebody responds that they're describing what is generally just a problem between two private property owners. We saw that in numerous cases where somebody said, well, there's a downspout coming off my neighbor's property and it washes out my, my property. We did try to weed through those things as what were systemic issues and what were just issues that would be best resolved between two private property owners. And we tried to group them in a way, and this is why the mapping came in handy, is to start plotting out areas to, we call them areas of concern, and plot them out, and then start digging in and looking at drainage areas, looking at old records of utilities, and then making site visits. So this ends up being a very interactive process for.
I'm sorry, can
whether-
you repeat what you just said about finding areas? I didn't quite understand what you said. I'm sorry.
So, sure, absolutely. So we would map out all the resident surveys, all the respondents, the location, and put a dot on a map. And then within each grouping, because it usually would find that if there's a problem, all the people around it responded. And you look just on a map of a town and say, those are the 6 areas where there's problems, 8 or 10 or whatever areas there were. And then what we did is in each of those groupings, tried to compare the descriptions of the respondents to see if there was, it was kind of common, so that there was some kind of consistency to it. And what we did is try to identify each area of concern that we wanted to investigate. And there were a couple outliers, just a one-off property that's off by itself. Like I said, that maybe it was just literally an issue between two private property owners that we kind of wanted to shy away from, because it was not something that the town in that case wanted to get involved with. But then after we kind of identified those initial areas of concern, we started walking the town. And that's where the task force or council would come into play, because you have a historical knowledge of the town that you can discuss with the consultant as you visit these areas of concern, to talk about what it used to look like, or anecdotally, in these smaller municipalities, a lot of people know each other, and you may have kind of the dirt on some of this stuff that we would not know from a respondent survey, because we're just coming into it as a consultant. So relaying that information and attending the site visits with the consultant on the team is really important. Then after an initial site visit, you start developing, and this will be one of the requirements of the grant, would be some community outreach and education. So that is something it's going to be multiple steps. I think the grant, if I'm not mistaken, Mark, you might be able to clarify, is 2 to 3 educational sessions that you have to provide as part of that.
Yeah.
So
We
as
dealt
the-
with that in our application. Yeah.
yeah. So as the consultant team, I guess, gets up to speed on the specific issues within the town, then it's much easier to craft a more focused educational component work session. Maybe it'd be appropriate at a council meeting to make one of the agenda items this educational component, where the consultant could give a presentation that was tailored to your residents and the issues that are specifically affecting them. Along with that, then you start developing concept plans. And I think we took the approach, and we usually do, whether it's this study or others, we try to come up with kind of, we'll call it good, better, best options. And we would brainstorm all the ideas of things that we could come up with to fix it, whether it's outlandish or whether it was just, something really simple. We would brainstorm all these ideas. And then we came up with a scoring matrix, and we would evaluate each idea to see whether or not it warranted further development. And we used some criteria, we weighted the criteria. Like if it helps one homeowner, it didn't get a lot of credit. But if it helped 2, it got more credit. And if it helped more than 5, it got a lot of credit. So we were trying to weigh it, because when you develop these ideas, the scope of the study is not broad enough to develop concept plans and cost estimates for every idea that you come up with, or else the study would take a really long time, and, that would be cost prohibitive. So we had to come up with a way to whittle down, 30, 40, 50 ideas down to something manageable, so that we could create concepts and cost estimates that could help inform a council on things that they could undertake. So that scoring matrix, and mind you, the task force and the council would have input on the matrix and how things were judged, because you'd have to help the consultant team determine what's important to the community, and you're in the best position to do that. It's kind of iterative. I think there'd be a lot of communication back and forth between the consultant team and the village. I guess as you step through this process, to have buy-in at each step of the way, before we proceed with the next step, and so on and so forth. But as we proceeded, we put together the concept plans based on the items that we had evaluated. And after the concepts were prepared, met individually with every affected property owner to kind of discuss it. Because once we had meetings, we had concept plans in hand, and went out to talk to a resident or a homeowner that might be affected by something either in front of their house or behind their house or something, and solicited their feedback. It gave us an opportunity to take that feedback and then revise the concepts based on their input. And I felt like it was really helpful to have the resident have some input and say in the process. So after that, it was a matter of compiling a final report that included cost estimates, an implementation plan and strategy, and the final concepts, which included some color ups and some renderings of things to kind of convey the idea. And then that was packaged up and provided to the council. I think in that case, I think we made 3 submissions so that we could obtain comments and develop it a little bit more each time until we got to the final that went over to DNR for their review. But at the end of the day, I think the goal at the end is to have an implementation strategy of things that can feasibly be done to help the problems that you're experiencing. And I think stepping through it in a methodical way, with kind of buy-in at each step, by the stakeholders, which is the council and the task force, and in essence, the residents too. I think allows for a bit more of a consensus when the report's done, so that there can be some desire to actually implement the things that were come up. I think at the end of the day, you don't want to go through this lengthy process that could take, 8 or 9 months and then say, well, that was good, but we don't want to do any of it. I think you really want to focus on things that are tangible and feasible to accomplish so that you can make an impact. I know it in essence, I guess it's a little bit of free money, I guess, by getting a DNR grant, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be put to good use and it provides some meaningful results. And I think I think there's too much time and effort on everybody's part preparing a report that like this to not have some consensus and buy-in at the end, that there's some will to implement the things that come out of it.
So the next things on your list, and I think that's the end of the list, is implementation strategy, which is how to implement.
Yeah.
And then the implementation of the strategies. You made a distinction there. Can you explain that?
Right. So what I think what's in the report is, okay, these are the things that we think that you should do as a consultant. Because they're feasible, they can be done now, whatever the things may be. And a lot of that will revolve around what the council is kind of leaning towards. For instance, if we come up with concepts that involve gray infrastructure, putting pipes in the ground, that is under the village's control. That's something that could be done. We probably recommend that because you have control over that. You can just do it. Then there are, I'll call it some pie in the sky things that may involve acceptance by a private property owner to implement something. Well, that's not under your control. So it might be recommended, but it's not something that you may have control over implementing. So once you get through the report and you have our recommendations, the next step is to actually implement it. And that means maybe hiring if you're going to consider regulatory changes, bringing an attorney on board to help craft sections of code that could be accepted and passed and incorporated into into your regulations. It could mean that appropriating money in the upcoming FY budget so that you have design and construction dollars allotted for specific projects. So that the implementation of the recommended strategies is kind of that's kind of what the council would do after the report's been published, is, making it happen. And that is, might revolve around creating new codes or appropriating money in a budget to get a contractor on board to build some of these things. And that might not happen quickly, but that implementation of the strategies might be dependent on where you are financially, and maybe it's spread out over a couple fiscal years, or not. That maybe you just bite it off all at once. That I guess that's kind of what the council would have to decide on.
Jason, in your experience, for some of this infrastructure stuff, is it possible to get money from the state or the county or utility or somebody else?
Yes. So, as you know, the storm drain network in the town is owned by Montgomery County DOT, and so while they may not have the budget to fund an upgrade to the system, they may be willing, if you're going to take the lead, to do some cost participation. So maybe they might be able to contribute to that. Additionally, there is a requirement, and I didn't talk about this earlier, but it's a permit that Montgomery County has. It's called an MS4 permit. It's a permit issued to the state. It's held by the county. It's a municipal separate sewer permit. And there are requirements of that permit that the county has that they have to treat impervious area in the county that's currently not treated. And so that program is administered by Montgomery County DEP. And we have worked on several projects where DEP has financed some stormwater management improvements as a way to get credits for their permit. So we just did a project in Tacoma Park where we put some of these bioretention areas adjacent to a roadway. We skinnied up the roadway a little bit by Hillwood Park, and the Montgomery County DEP contributed money to the construction of this because they were getting MS4 credits for the project because it was treating stormwater. So there are options if these tree boxes or things like that you might consider on some roadways, there might be some ways to get some money from DEP for that.
What did
Jeffrey,
you
I
mean
think
by a
there's a
credit?
hand up.
I'm sorry, it looks like Jeffrey.
Yep.
Jeff?
Yeah, hi folks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hi, I'm gonna wave. I just left my office. There's a little bit of a wind tunnel, but I just wanted to chime in real quick because I know our time is running out. First, I just want to say back to this discussion and presentation. And as folks know, I'm on the council, but also treasurer. So there's a bunch of things that we're thinking of, considering, and really looking forward. I know Thursday, tomorrow, we're actually going to be taking up that discussion. And I believe this task force is going to perhaps have some ideas for us to consider. And I just wanted to, just a couple things I wanted to just in a quick soundbite. So I think focusing on obviously the technical assessment will be great, and giving us more information about the things we can do. And that's inclusive of very specific capital improvement projects, right, that are in our control, that some are already underway, but some things that we may not have thought of just yet. Also, the importance of the VMA construction and building code, the standards, but as part of that, really understanding proper enforcement. But something that came up this year that was really concerning and caused a lot of anxiety for our community and residents in particular is that code and the interpretation of which is flexible enough to address moving targets and ambiguities, because the developers from the private side as well as the county, we're not always aligned, and we need to also be in a position that we can protect our residents who may be adjacent to a tear down, and just really being cognizant of flexibility, because something we design today may be outdated tomorrow. The coordination piece is so important. We also had meetings with the county around, again, very specific resident concerns about also tear downs, new developments, and linkages from the private property to the municipal lines. And the coordination is just so absolutely critical. The leveraging of resources, I thought, spectacular, and the incentives and things that we should look at. Are there pilot programs like around the rainscapes that we could start to even look into immediately for next year? I think that is fabulous. And then finally, I just, again, really wanted to stress the importance of your statement of feasibility, near-term action, and impact, because as you know, we don't want to have a study that we do and then it sits on a shelf. We want to really have a series of things that we can implement near term, and then some of these other considerations that may require blended or layered capital, which may be beyond, even though we have some healthy reserves, we know that any particular capital project could eat up most of those. So those are just some of the thoughts, and again, just really fantastic discussion and really appreciative. over back to the committee.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jeff. Does anybody else have a question or have a topic that has not been covered that they'd like to cover?
I'll raise my hand again. I'm sorry.
No, feel free.
First of all, Jason, thank you. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Along the way, I have a million comments, but this one keeps sticking in my claw. So I'm going to throw it out there. How do you determine the degree of public harm? Okay, public being the bigger picture than the private. What's the degree of the public harm that comes from the problems on private property? How do we figure out whether or not what's happening to somebody's private property becomes a public issue that we should put public dollars to? How is this an obscure question? You're probably thinking I'm nuts.
No, I don't. And it is a very difficult thing. I know
Okay.
there are communities that just say it's private property. You
Yeah,
bought the
right,
property,
exactly.
you know,
Your
buyer
problem,
beware.
your problem, not ours.
Yeah.
So how do you
And
figure out?
I understand that, you know, but I also understand that, you know, whether it's the state, the county, or the village is somewhat complicit in the creation of the problem by not having anything in place that
Good
would
point.
prevent this from
Good
happening.
point.
And
Really good.
so it is a very fine line. And I'm not a politician, and I try to keep in my lane and stick to crunching numbers and playing with concrete, but I am, you know, I can be compassionate and empathetic to this from both sides, because I have often said this, and I wish they would teach people how to buy a house in school, like, because I can tell you, I've been called hundreds of times over the last 25 years about people that want to do stuff on their property and they bought it and they can't. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but most people do more research about buying a TV or a laptop than they do about buying a house. They walk into a house, they look at it, and they say, "This is beautiful, I want it." And they don't look at a master plan. They don't look at drainage patterns. They don't look at a lot of stuff. And nowadays, hell, you don't even, you forego a home inspection. So
Right.
I think it's a very uneducated public in general. So I have a hard time just kind of saying, because it's prevalent. It's not one or two people that just don't do the research. I think it's just home buyers in general don't look at this stuff. And so I think it's a little hard to say just buyer beware, because it's just not something that is a cultural norm. I think, and I mean, I certainly check all that stuff, but that's because that's my job. So it's hard to not feel a little compassion for people that get into situations because they just see this beautiful house and they just want it. But it is a very fine line, and I know that Section 3 tried to tackle this particular issue a couple years ago by adopting some kind of guidelines about, well, we consider spending some public money if it had more than 2 acres of drainage area and it was caused by multiple properties and da. So they were trying to weed out the people that were just saying, you know, one homeowner was causing a problem on an adjacent homeowner. That's not what they want to spend money on. But if it was a systemic problem that kind of came to be because there were no controls put in place and people were just allowed to build and build and build, well, you know, I can kind of see the point of trying to do something, but where to draw that line is it's way out of my lane. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Oh, you
or
did. Thank you. It just I think it means that we need to think about this as a committee about what's the degree of public harm that's going to arise from anybody's complaint on this survey. It's not simple. None of this is. That's kind of a stupid statement, but and then how much can we remedy it? How can, from a municipal standpoint, from a government standpoint? It's just maybe stuff I'm thinking we need to keep in the back of our head as we move forward or not move forward. So enough.
Sure.
I'll stop talking.
Yep. You know, I know we're running out of time today, but if more questions, comments, you know, whatever, anything that comes up, I think it probably could be funneled through Mark, and he can get it to me so that I can try to respond, or if we have to have a second session at some point down the road, we could do that.
All right, is there anything else anybody can think of that they'd like to get out of this meeting before we shut it down?
No, just thank you very much. Really appreciated this, Jason. Great to hear your expert perspective on all of this.
Thank you.
Really?
It was a pleasure meeting all of you.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Jason.
chat, everyone. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right,
We're done. huh?
Bye-bye.
Good job. Okay.
thank you all.